Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone here for the final lecture of the 1999 Spring Guest Lecture Series. Thanks everyone for your participation in this college event, and I promise that next fall and spring we will have just as great of a season as we've had this spring. So again, thanks for coming. Also, I'd like to thank our student hosts for tonight's reception. That's Ryan Justick and Joel Weststraight. Thanks very much. Again, after the lecture, please join us for refreshments and take advantage of the opportunity to talk with our guest lecturer, Bernardo Fort-Brescia, tonight, as well as to walk through the gallery that's open. And I'd also like to thank and now introduce our faculty host for tonight's lecture, Associate Professor Daniel Doze.
This was the only way they could get me to sit in front. So, well, I'm very happy to introduce our guest, Bernardo Fort-Brescia, tonight. And I would like to start my introduction by a quote taken from Beth Dunlop's introduction to Arquitectonica. And I quote, "The firm's first buildings, among them the Spear House, the Babylon, the Palace, the Atlantis, and the Imperial, were complex and colorful, abstract and audacious. They seemed to synthesize the idea of the new Miami, a city once palpable and elusive." I think what is most exciting about the firm's work is the playfulness and the spirits of the forms and the color and how, most importantly, they react or act to light. I think this is a very interesting quality that you'll see in all of their work and how they use that as a spatial definer. This unique quality that is quite, can be witnessed throughout their work that spans 24 years, if I calculate exactly. And Bernardo was telling us at supper that actually his first project, the Spear House, was done a year basically after he graduated with his master's degree at the age of 23. So it started quite young, his career, and it's quite impressive, I must say. When I got his resume here, and it is actually very impressive. If we look at the quantity of awards that the firms and he has received over the years, which more than 30 awards have been received. We have he has lectured and had panel discussion more than 50 times. Their work was featured in more than 30 exhibits worldwide. Their work covers an incredible span from houses to shopping malls, from embassies to airports. I mean, this is quite incredible. Then it was interesting to discover that I always thought they only had one office in Miami, Florida, but then listening to him talking about next week being in Riyadh and then in Manila, and then they have an office in Paris and Shanghai, etc., all throughout the world. Even in America, they have 3 offices, which is quite an accomplishment after only 24 years in business. So it is my great privilege to introduce you to Bernardo, who for the little story, graduated from, if I get it correctly, in '75 from Harvard after trying 1 week at MIT, where he was not too happy there. Previously graduated with a bachelor from Princeton. So these are quite impressive. One of his professors was Michael Grave, who he was very happy, I hear later on, to beat him in 2 competitions. So always pleased when you can beat your prof, I guess. So anyway, without any further delay, please help me in welcoming Bernardo Fort-Brescia for tonight's lecture.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to come here today. I'll first begin by introducing who we are and our origins for those of you who may not know much about us. And so I think we picked about 12 slides that'll give you a general overview of the beginnings of our practice. And then thereafter, I'll really tell you more what I'm doing now and what are the projects that are going on in our firm. Why don't we get started? Do I have control of the lights? Oh. And I begin with precisely that house, just one slide of it. But it is because it tells us as architects why we should never underestimate any project, because this was just a single-family house, and in fact not that large, not as large as it may seem from the slides. But it was our first opportunity to experiment with our ideas and to teach us about how to be sensitive about a place where you practice, how you react to the location and the climate, the client, and the character and sort of architectural history of the place. And at the same time, it was, of course, our attempt to remain within the modernity that represents our generation. And these were difficult times for modernists like us, because we were in the middle of the postmodern revolution, so to speak. And it is within modernity that we were attempting to introduce in our own way our own perception of the world. And in this first house, we had dreams, of creating some kind of urban house in the suburbs. And dreams are very important in everything one does. And we thought that this may transform a suburban city in a more urban place. And we created a house with an interior space, walled in. We tried to exploit the colors of the place in an unexpected manner, introduce elements like water and landscape as part of the composition. And it is, however, not much later than that house that we continued our exploration of space, of carving out of volume rooms that were part of the outdoors and yet partially indoors. And in this, one of our first high-rise projects, only, in fact, 2 years after the house that I showed you was completed, was our first re-examination of the transformation of the city into more of a metropolis. And we were really obsessed still with a script, with having a story for the buildings, some literary side to them, and dealing with the issues of scale in the modern city. And in these slides, you can see the whole notion of dreams that young architects have, in which we immediately envisioned this building as some kind of a vertical city. This is how we gave reason for everything you see there. And as if it was a small town that was turned on its side, and that we had carved out of the grid that you see there, filled in with the apartments that make up this 100-unit building, and how we carved out of that grid that main square up in the sky. And that became the symbol of the building, like the square is a symbol of a small town. And how it also added a whole new dimension to the building so that it would be legible from a distance from the highways, giving it also some kind of a billboard power in the skyline. And subsequent to that, we continued to do high-rise with that same sense of sort of a painterly quality. On the right, thinking of the building more as some kind of canvas that was flat and thin, and that stood on its side facing the approach. Or in the left, the rethinking of the building as a collage, as made out of more than one building, possibly, and where different forms could interact with each other, intersect, as you see in this building on the left-hand side. And our practice, which started with private sector projects, because that was our only opportunity. You know, it was pretty difficult to break into the public sector without a resume, without a list of projects that they could check in mathematically of how many schools or how many courthouses you have done. And, but after a while, we're successful in obtaining some smaller projects as well, and start our practice in the public sector, like on the left, this branch courthouse, and on the right, the Swimming Hall of Fame, our first sports-related project, which included a theater, a museum that you see on the top of the slide on the right. And on the left, it was also a continuous exploration of the skin with some kind of a graphic strength, and our continued intent of the building being some kind of abstract composition, some collage of pieces that came together very much in a manner that you would deal with a painting, but turned into the 3 dimensions. And even on the right, where the whole site plan, where you see the striping running through the swimming pool, reappearing on the parking lots and the driveways, becomes a unifying shape on which all these different buildings occur. Our practice then started to evolve into foreign lands, and this is our first project abroad, headquarters for a bank, fairly large one for us at the time, a 500,000 square foot building, in a horizontal building, which was somewhat of a departure for us, but it was our first institutional project. You can see on the right-hand side the courtyard, and the left-hand side a piece of the skin of the building, and how the building had dual personalities, and very much like in the first buildings, where on one side you saw that, for example, in the Atlantis, the blue grid, and very colorful, and on the opposite side, a very glassy and very pure prism. This building had a personality to the outside that was corporate, and in the black and blue design of the facade. And then when it entered the inside courtyard, a very monumental courtyard, it was quite different. Oops, I did something wrong. It became more lively and more human and more more intentionally designed for the users of the building, for the people who worked within it. And in these 2 images, you can see the contrast of the coloration and composition of the inside and the outside. The taut facade of the outside in that black stone is still interrupted by these forms that you see suspended from it, as you see on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, the stone, sort of the random pattern stone of the building with the green glass, has a completely different tonality that is warmer, the cold sort of corporate image of the outside to the warmer sort of human side of the users of the building. And, but in addition to that, the use of color no longer being applied, but just coming out of the essence of the materials. All the colors you see on the left-hand side are in fact derived from the materials themselves. Inside that wedge shape where the boardroom is the warm yellow color of the stone that becomes the source. And the greenery that gets reflected on the plane that you see on the right-hand side comes out of the glass of the windows, or the blue from the soffits of the lower level. Oops, I keep pressing the wrong button. And sorry. There you go. And also, not forgetting the spatial qualities of the inside, where you can see in these 2 views the power of the space inside. And the element of surprise, because from the exterior, in this building is difficult to imagine that one would discover verticality in the strength and dimension that these 2 spaces portrayed. And in fact, it is a space that penetrates through the building and reappears out to the sky, and sends a message about the solidity and the success of this company. After that bank, we continued doing other banks, and our practice, the first building that I just showed you was in South America, my native land. But soon after its completion, we were hired to do this other bank in Europe in a completely different environment. You can see this building at the end of the axis in the context of an old city. You can see beyond our building and some older buildings that are directly adjacent, and the balance of the neighborhood, sort of a reconstructed neighborhood after the German bombing of Luxembourg, where this building is. And this building is intended to fit in. And on the right-hand side, you can see our interest in composing the facade, almost like an abstract painting made out of these different elements. The main body of the building in stone with an amber-colored glass, all hanging off a center core of black stone, and off to one side, so the glass tower, that completes the axis partially, and partially allows the view to go past into the old portion of the city that was managed to be preserved through those years of the bombings. It is, you can see to the right the simplicity of the floor plan of what this is, a rather small building as it surfaces off the ground. In fact, the building has about 250,000 square feet, but 2/3 of the building occurs underground. And you can see on the left-hand side the row of bank buildings that were built during the post-war era, and following the rules of urbanism of the city, how a building sort of blends in and becomes an additional building that lines up with the street, and yet then suddenly it starts doing other things. It levitates off the ground, suspended and supported by a single big rock of granite, which holds the name of the company, and the glass tower that terminates the axis, as you see here. Here you can see the intersection of the main volume of the building and the tower that contains all the special spaces, including the lobby and the library and the meeting rooms and the boardroom at the top, and the simplicity of the front facade and how it's suspended off the ground so that the core from which it comes out is all in black, almost like a shadow, in contrast with the yellow color of the stone that shines in the light of the sun. This shows you some of the details and of the composition and the use of the gray and green coolness of this building compared to its counterpart in the amber and yellow stone. And then these are some of the interior spaces. And in fact, the part of the whole effort is how to bring the natural light down into the lower spaces of the building, where it immediately expands in a very large way. And here you can see the cool color of the vertical volume, and in contrast, the yellow the color of the glass as it looks out into the older sections of town. And here you can see one of the interior spaces. This is one of the dining rooms in the building, and this is the auditorium entirely, everything, all of this underground. You can see how the lighting of the building reinforces the direction from thicker to thinner lines that eventually fall down and become the background for the speaker. And the boardroom and offices, and the use of the subtle use of the material. In fact, this is the same maple that is simply turned around in the direction of the veining of the wood to create that design on the wood. In fact, depending on where you see it, it looks solid, and then suddenly the image appears. Our search for other means of expression has always been a reaction to the condition in which, in the givens of a property and of a project. And in this case, we were confronted with a really difficult task. This is a new American embassy back to Latin America in an era of danger, of embassy takeovers and potential attacks by guerrillas. This is the first embassy built by the United States in the program for making embassies safer since the bombing in Beirut and the attacks in Iran. And some of the rules included how to deal with blast protection. And embassies were preferred not to have any inner corners so that there would be no resonance of an explosion. And therefore, this building is a clean, simple rectangle. And we were given a maximum of 2% of glass, and the maximum dimension being 24 inches by 24 inches. So, in fact, we decided to design some kind of a big tapestry, almost, and using the sort of mixing pre-Columbian geometry and early American patterning. We combined the two to create what you see here. Essentially, a huge sort of fabric that envelopes the building and transforms it into something else than a building. You can see the building in the context of the mountains that surround it. And in fact, you can't really tell which is really a window and which isn't if you were a sniper, because not all of these are real windows. Some are and some are not. And it is irrelevant at this point. It really becomes part of the design of that fabric, as you see here in these partial images, where the use of the native colors of gold and the more steel-like colors of America and the mixture of vertical and horizontal geometries became part of the composition. Even to the level of the detailing of disintegrating the main door and making it almost feel like a fabric, as if it was soft, even though, in fact, as you can imagine, this is a very thick steel door. Some of the symbols of America reappear in the main lobby, as you can see here, where the grand vertical space is clad in these blue metallic panels that are suspended over the stripes of wood and stone at the base. Today, I'm going to show you now some of the work that is underway or that we have on the boards, in fact. And what I will begin is telling you about our project in New York City. Many of you who may have visited New York may recognize where Times Square is and what 42nd Street is. As you all know, there's Broadway that crosses the grid of New York, and there is 42nd Street here, which is, particularly in this block, is a sort of the entertainment heart of New York, the entertainment district of New York. And what you see here in red, this half a block, is the project that we're involved in today. And to give you a little bit of history of the place, this was the original Times building on Times Square. Not recognizable today. It's filled with billboards and a new facade. And surrounding it were very sort of modest, smaller buildings. And this was in 1905, as you can see here. But the district very rapidly changed and became sort of the entertainment district of New York, with a mixture of the grand theaters of New York, like the Belasco, as you see here, which had this sort of grand style, and the first event in which architecture and graphic design come together, as you can see on the right, where announcements became an integral part of the iconography of the place. And soon after, with the advent of the wars, it became the real entertainment district with the great movies. And movies started to become part of entertainment in addition to theater. And also, of course, electricity. And here you can see the evolution of the city. And by the time of the Korean War, already the place started to deteriorate, and it became a place for entertainment for the troops. And it is, as not too many years ago, as you may recall, it really deteriorated to what you see here on the left, with the pornographic shops and a lot of crime. Then came the state of New York and shut all this down, as you can see here on the right-hand side. And that is the site that we were given. Today, of course, Times Square has wholesome entertainment like the Disney store, and pornographic shops are almost entirely gone, except for a few across the street. on 8th. And, but this is the site that was handed over to us. Everything, this agglomeration of billboards and stores is at the site from all the way over here across and next to the street behind. This is actually the headquarters of the New York Times, even though they do not publish pornography. So what was the task? These are some of the tenets that were part of the planning or the replanning of Times Square. And one of them is that we had to recognize that the American city is made out of historical layering. That no different than Europe, but mostly 20th century historical layering. That in fact we didn't have an emperor like Paris who dictated a unified style for the city, or even a unified height for that matter, like Paris had. But in fact that historical layering is very much part of the American city and definitely part of New York. And that maybe if we were going to preserve Times Square, that part of the idea was unplanning. That in fact, if it became too planned, it would turn into some kind of shopping mall. And that is not the idea. The idea is to bring back the pedestrian life to the sidewalks of Times Square. And the part of it is also contradiction and surprise, that you in fact turn the corner and discover something new, and that it is not what is a city where you expect things to happen. And that the pedestrian experience was the essence of going to Times Square, and is the essence of New York, in fact. It has the busiest sidewalks in the world. And that, in fact, buildings can become visual anchors, and visual anchors are important in the planning of cities. And that, in the end, aesthetics is an attraction, and that, and therefore, the appearance of buildings is very much part of the character of the city, as pre-established by the Chrysler Building, or the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, and many other examples in the city. So, our planning of this block, which you see here, included the hotel itself with its restaurants on the ground floor on one side of this L-shaped site, but along 42nd Street having all the stores opening out to the street. In fact, everything that you see here in purple are the stores. In fact, everything you see in gray, by the way, hard to believe, are fire exits. So the curse of architects, you know, fire exits. But in fact, we have to exit, you see here the entrance, all these movie theaters that you see up here. That are entered up to the upper floors. We remove the theaters from the ground floor to give life to the sidewalk. And in fact, we forced all the stores. This is the actual ground floor, and this is the basement where you see the on the right-hand side. So this store, for example, begins on the ground floor and goes down to a basement. And this store climbs up to a second floor. And this one is 3 stories, as is this yellow one. Sometimes we do have one that is just on grade, and others that are entered up and occupy a very large floor or down. So by doing this sort of vertical planning, instead of a floor plan planning, we did a section planning. The city became alive with activated storefronts all along as you walk down the street. And it is above that there's the small hotel with its atrium, and then that larger hotel that you will see in a second. And I'll show you how we experimented with this project, because we were confronted with a really difficult situation. In fact, if you really take a rectangle out of this building, it was pretty chunky. It was not a slender, tall building. And we sought to redefine the proportions of this building. And we tested many schemes. And in this one scheme, we suddenly picked up the pencil and went, what if we split it in half and in a curve and created 2 different shapes that coming together became one building, but in fact resembled 2 buildings interacting with each other. The one on the right, rising towards the sky, elevated off the ground almost in an impossible manner. Below it is the lobby of the hotel that is all in glass, that you can look into this glass atrium. And on the left, the building that is anchored to the ground. And we also started looking at what do we do with the lower building that zoning dictated in the front. And we realized this was going to be filled with billboards, and maybe the building itself should be a huge billboard. And I'll show you the evolution. In fact, you can see here how we started thinking of the base of the building being made out of sometimes existing buildings and sometimes new ones, and how the big billboard would blend in and become the mother of all billboards, behind all these other billboards that we knew were coming downstream. And we looked at the building first in black and white, and you can see that we started thinking of horizontal striping on the building that was more anchored to the ground, and some vertical striping to the one that was taking off to the sky. In fact, the plain rectangular building, by this minor move at the top and the split, became two buildings and created, by the nature of the concept, the skyline for the building. We were trying to avoid, in fact, the whole idea of the base, middle, and top, particularly the whole idea of top, of a crown, which was very much a New York thing of finishing the building, adding a top. And instead, we wanted to make the top and the identity of the building be also the identity of the entire body of the building, not just happening separately at the top. Also, we started to think of how color can help us define these buildings, and that's why this one started to be seen as a building almost in a steel blue color, the other one in more like a rust or earth color, this one reaching to the ground, the other one rising to the sky in the metallic sort of aerospace type of color. And it is, and also how to deal with the big billboard. And in fact, the billboard became this gigantic mosaic because we had to have windows, because we have an additional 150 rooms we had to fit in this lower component. And we said, well, if the image is large enough and abstract enough, it can. And by the way, it can still read. And all we did is, by the way, we took some Xeroxes, black and white Xeroxes, and with color pencil, we turned this collage into these various pieces that you see here. And just like this is how it's being built. Above it, by the way, it's also a hotel. It's a larger hotel. It has 950 rooms. It's a pretty large hotel, a conventional hotel. Up on the 40s, up here is what we call the 42nd Street Club, became the club floor from which the suites rose, and this became a secondary lobby for the building. And this is looking from the Hudson River and from New Jersey, where the map of Broadway reappears as part of the skin of that floor. And you can see here the final version of the facade as it became. And now that you've seen the result, I'll show you the evolution, because we did all kinds of schemes before settling for that one. Actually, we really liked this one a lot. And this was sort of more of a contorted building that zigzagged its way up from Times Square. We had this idea of Times Square is about light, and the previous scheme that you saw has this sort of streak of light that rises up the building. This one instead was some kind of lightning coming down. Our client thought it looked dangerous. It is, and in this one where we said, well, it's New York, and we said we're going to create this colossus, like in Rhodes, that was standing there announcing the arrival to Times Square. Our client thought this was definitely, we must have been smoking something. It was, we'll keep experimenting with these ideas. It actually was easier to build, we told them, It's very rectilinear, it's some kind of robotic sort of transformer coming towards New York. But you can't, you may have a lot of ideas and you can only build one, so at least for now. And you can see here some of the other sketches, sort of the watercolor sketches that became part of the evolution of the project, and then the abstract model and with the lighting coming through, because in fact that's how the city feels at nighttime, and how we made sure that all this worked in 3 dimensions, and then eventually a very detailed model with all the signage and all the names of the tenants, and that are the reality. At one point, Disney had an interest in this project, and they still have a store as part of this project, but we had a bottle of vodka here, and Disney turned it into water. They said they couldn't be associated with image of alcohol. You know, it is, and here you can see the final version models and superimposed against the rest of the skyline of that neighborhood of New York, as you see it here, and as the building is being built now. We've designed all the interiors down to the plates. It's a very good client. I mean, it's fantastic. We got to design the bedspreads, the special carpeting in the bedrooms, everything down to the towels. But it was the beginning of our exploration into other forms for high-rises, which are very much part of our practice. And there's little models that shows you our interest in dealing with the building in section, not just in floor plan. That in fact, a floor plan can be a perfect square, and simply the manipulation of section would transform a building. And even in a prismatic shape like this one, the asymmetrical carving out of this sort of Superman shape is very much part of what we try to explore. And in this very simple tower in Hong Kong, for the headquarters of the Lai Sun company, owners of the crocodile brand that you may sometimes wear, we divided the building into these 3 buildings that are cutting like knives up into the sky, and staggered one in relation to each other at different angles. Or in this advertising agency in Sao Paulo, where the building is simply one single cut on one side that makes the square floor plan vary ever so slightly from floor to floor. Or in this one, the headquarters of the Commercial and Industrial Bank of China in Shanghai, where the sail and the cylinder, or the mast, come together to form a more complete, a larger floor, even to the top floors, so that only this element becomes the extra sort of antenna that rises beyond the building, but always with the intent of the building being one single idea, and not simply having some kind of add-on towards the top, but the top being sort of the resultant of the concept. And or in this building, recently completed now in Shanghai, the Shanghai Information Center, in which these 2 buildings, by the sheer subtraction of elements, or in this case even slight movement of a piece of the building, and giving one skin to the main body of the building and a second skin to that cube that sort of shifts off to one side where the main corporate offices are located, transforms the profile of the building into something else, like this C and this H. This being the terrace, by the way, of the cafeteria. The columns being turned into some kind of a modern-day Chinese screen that filters the light into the terrace itself, the core being able to come through right through the middle of the space. I'll show you here some of the other images of that building. I went too fast, right? And daytime and nighttime. And our continuing practice, as in this building in Manila, the Philippine Stock Exchange, or to the left, also in Manila, the coming together of these 2 sort of curvilinear waving shapes that at nighttime only it's striping that begins dense at the bottom and rises and fades towards the top, or on the right, giving it horizontal movement, are coming together into a very thin space which is the source of the light that brings the 2 towers together. These quite advanced and nearing completion. As everybody in Manila, by the way, you have to have a heliport on top. It is the only way to go from place to place. Otherwise, it takes hours. And this, our more recent office building in Hong Kong for our client for whom we do all of their work. And this is, in fact, where our offices are. And they just demolished us to build this building, so we had to move out. So we, as they say, we dug our own grave, you know. This is a new 50-story office building. Really, this being what explains it best, a very tight site. And in Hong Kong, you have to use every inch because it's so valuable. And in fact, the rectangular building, all it has is a little curve at the end, But this curve at the top becomes this wave, almost as it was fluttering in the wind. And that curvilinear shape reappears just in this little portion that we carved out of the main facade of the building, so that it creates this sense of the intersection of two volumes, of two buildings that are coming together. It is, I'll show you here, maybe this explains through these views of the model the building at its best. And here you can see, in fact, the composition and how every 3 stories a horizontal line defines, a thicker horizontal line defines that building versus the thin lines that define the first volume, and how they're just sort of engaging each other. And in the opposite side, the reverse occurring and the other building reappearing. And you can see it here in the context of overcrowded Hong Kong. At the end of the street, all you see is the cylindrical shape, which sort of marks the termination and marks the entrance to the building and to the subway station in Queens Road. And how you will see that thin building in between the other tall buildings of Hong Kong, and intentionally how we added a whole new scale. Here you can see it rising behind all these other buildings. Our same client has built all this, and in fact we're building right in here in the middle of all this a very big 1.5 million square foot shopping center that we're redoing in the middle of this. This particular owner, by the way, built these 12,000 apartments that you see there, literally 250,000 people population. It is, in contrast, I show you this new project in Paris, where on the axis of La Défense, we were given 4 city blocks, and you can see how the blocks are crossing through the site and underneath to build this mega sort of horizontal tower, as the French call it, la tour couchée, the sleeping tower. And precisely because of the light and zoning requirements, the building was intended to step down towards the end of this boulevard. In fact, there is a boulevard that today sinks into some kind of a ugly basement and drives under the esplanade of La Défense. And what we did is we picked up the green of the boulevard and took it up the building like a park that is tilted, that you can see as you drive down the boulevard, and then you split on either side of this very glassy building that holds up this green lawn. And the building is interrupted by the peripheral expressway here, and by a pedestrian esplanade and drop-off to the middle here. There has another arrival through this cone that you see here that gives light to the arrival below. And with this, I'll take you through some of the images in the section. The building has, at the center of it, its own internal series of parks inside an atrium. In fact, France has requirements of natural light for every office. So the thickness of the block resulted in this inside space to provide additional light for everyone. Only a Xerox machine or fax machine don't require natural light in France. Every individual has to have a window for their desk. And you can see here the overview of how the building sort of rests in the middle of the site, and the view through the interior gardens that terrace down. It's our practice of this office building type continues in the United States. And this project is in Orlando, across from the Orange County Courthouse, where a plaza is defined by 3 major buildings, and of course, what else in America, our large garage that is lined up with shops below. And I'll try to focus primarily on that tall building. This is the top of the building, and the top of the building is a room, this huge cube that you see here with this orange grove inside it. And in fact, rising from the, I removed the trees, you know, in the middle of it is this observatory people can climb into. And something's not happening on the other side, right? Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. I messed up. I pressed the wrong button. Can you help me where I'm supposed to be? Is that where I am? Okay. There you go. The floor plate is what people are asking for today. These very large, 23,000 square foot floor plates for very large corporations. And I have messed up somehow here. 1 second. I can't get to the facade, right? Sorry, there you go. That's what I wanted to explain. On how the building is intended to simply frame the sky. Instead of doing some kind of spire or pyramid or something on the top, we chose to create just a huge monumental space. This is 150 feet by 150 feet. A place where you would want to go, or from a distance that you would just simply frame the clouds and the blue skies of Central Florida, and from which you can see forever on those flat plains of Florida. The base of the building is this very elongated colonnade that marks the entrance to the building and its lobbies in the lower levels. And the main body of the building is simply very neutral, simply split in half, almost as if there were 4 piers that were holding up this cube. And I think now I can take you through. That's the drawing I needed to explain. And you can see how the piers sort of emerge into the inside of the building in its simplicity. All there are these simple tall colonnade with this black core in the center and this marble mosaic in the middle with sort of images of the history of Central Florida. And these are some of the views of the public spaces. In fact, trying to redefine a sort of more urban environment in what these cities today have, which are rather suburban. The floor plan that you saw there is the lobby. Almost the floor, almost as if it was shadows of those long columns being cast on the floor. And there you can see the building on its context. The tall arcade that leads into the plaza here, the tall buildings that are facing the approach from the highway, and the center of the courthouse complex, the main square that you see over to that side. Can you advance? Yeah, there you go. And can you advance once more? Well, there you can see the balance of the image of the building. Can you advance that one? There you go. Okay. I'm going to show you here a more commercial project in the book of our office. It is this is a more recently completed commercial project. This is in Hong Kong. It's a mega shopping center, 7 levels on top of 2 train stations and a public transport terminal, what they call that, which is a giant bus terminal. All of this happening in the middle and underneath. It is a very busy place. It transfers 26,000 passengers per hour that traverse this building from different levels. Therefore, as you'll see from the images, there's 85 escalators that connect the different levels of this building. It's at the entrance to Hong Kong from China as you come out of the Lions Rock Tunnel. And it's right at the edge of the hill. And in fact, this is our first sort of airbrush drawing of how we envisioned the building. Almost like a giant palisade, these series of strata or layers of materials that create this sort of architectural and very geometric sort of cliff. And this cliff is cut by the series of spaces that are these crystals. And here you can see one of them, another one, that become the public spaces and expose to the public arriving on the trains the activity within. And you'll see there's an ice rink in this one, and there's a big train arrival in this one, and there's a sort of a dining area that opens to the park on the opposite side here. And hidden inside this black zone are the buses and that are concealing the public transport terminal at the street level on the opposite side. The folds are, these are preliminary drawings, the folds are very much part of a way of transforming the giant box of this very massive solid building into this more of a painting. And you can see the beginnings of the gold panels and the green stone and the black stone and the red marble and the stainless steel panels and the white ceramic panels that form the building. And the lighting contributes to that also. The cool blue light of the what we call the glacier, the ice rink above, or the warm color of the arrival from the train stations below. And to the right, you can see the buildings without those crystals and how they were intended to be shaped in concept. And these became the interior spaces. And to the right, probably the most important of the spaces, which is the ice rink, where these elliptical sort of clouds or islands are suspended off the food areas so that people are dining, looking down onto the ice rink. And these were our initial sketches of the building, and I show you the evolution because this is the building that I only have a few slides of it. It just got completed, and this is looking as you come out of the hills from Lion's Rock and where the building appears in front of you. And these are some of the views. This was still sort of semi under construction as it was being completed next to the park, and you can see here some of the other views. And these are the spaces inside. And you can see here the sculptural play of escalators. There were so many escalators that we needed to turn them into almost some kind of a mobile or some kind of a piece of sculpture that occurred in the middle of the space. And we used the boxes, the landings of the escalators, to create this sort of composition of these almost like modern day chandeliers, these cubes that are suspended at different angles and that became sort of part of the image of the place. And here you can see as one looks up into the various spaces. It is in the crisis of Hong Kong, this is an extremely successful project. To take these pictures, it was very difficult because it's generally just incredibly crowded. It is packed with people every day of the week, almost all the time. The ice rink only closes between 2 in the morning and 6 in the morning to refurbish, and at 6 in the morning it opens and it's full immediately with ice skating classes. It's amazing. Here you can see the various slabs of the buildings as they crisscross rising towards the skylit spaces, these sort of glass, sort of crystal elements that define the various cuts through the building. We continue, of course, with not everything we do is of this scale. I mean, we also do smaller things, and this is the new science museum in Los Angeles, in Santa Ana, California, in Orange County, California, to be exact. Building right on the highway, and which started originally with an existing building, that little box that you see here, that was a warehouse that was being converted into the museum, and now has evolved into this full-fledged building that we started with the origins of the renovation of the building, where you see these sort of earth forms here, this wavy, earthy building that you see here behind, which was simply the recladding of the building. But then we added the lobby, and then we added, we needed to give it life from the highway and some identity from the highway, and that is where the weather exhibit occurs, and which is also part of the image of the building, which is this very large cube that you see here. In fact, you can see it here in the initial sketches, and which is how it's just been built and just completed. This cube that is sort of teetering, coming off the building and suspended, it is, we had to deal with the imagery of science, and we said, well, if we're going to do another sphere, and how can we deal with, has science been through the modern day? And one of the biggest challenges was how to challenge gravity, and how can this building tell us a little bit about man's conquest of nature through science. And we thought of the cube as a very pure shape that when rotated, it was no longer sitting on the logical side as it related to gravity. And the rotation of the cube, which is sort of what you can do with your computer, sort of, you can move it around and be free from that control, became the symbol of the building. And this, I don't have this is one of the first shots that I had. The cube is being clad right now in that black panelization for projections that you just saw. But this is the building as it was being completed. And in fact, that's, oops, Can you change the carousels? Sorry about that. And small buildings like this continue to be part of our practice. And here you can see the new building for the Miami City Ballet, a building that has a tradition. It started in some storefronts, and today is a very famous ballet company that is led by Edward Villela, the famous Balanchine dancer. But we wanted to continue that tradition, and what you can see here, this is the sidewalk in Miami Beach, and these are the windows that look into the various rehearsal halls. And these are the rehearsal rooms, and this is a convertible one into a rehearsal hall for specific shows. This is the entrance to the building that leads to the various halls that are visible from the street. And you can see here the facade of the building itself, almost like a series of picture frames. These are the windows of the management and administration. These are the windows into the rehearsal halls, which are tall spaces, but the windows had to be low, obviously, so that they wouldn't be glary into those spaces. And all these 5 rehearsal rooms, as I said, almost like picture frames, are freestanding in relation to this sort of curvilinear shape facing the ocean. And here you can see how they come together with the main ballet building and the arrival and foyer in the lower levels. These are the main offices of the building, and these are the rehearsal halls as they march down. And these are some of the other images of this building, also under construction right now. I take you now into the last few projects, and these are larger projects. And the first one I'm going to show you is the new international arrivals and departures, the main terminal at the Miami International Airport. The project began with this drawing that you see here, where we were trying to think of the design as something that was interpretative. In fact, is it some kind of multi-winged Icarus, or is it that you're underwater and this is the sort of waves, or are they clouds that are hovering over you? But this is, in fact, the roof of the building that became the envelope that is identifiable from the air as you land. And in fact, one of the difficulties of the building was that the edge that we were given was rather jaggedy. It was determined by the turning radii of the wings of the planes. And we needed to fit a very large building. This is a fairly large terminal, over 1.5 million square feet. And how to fit a mega terminal like this in an existing airport, an airport that had to be built where there was one. It's not that we could start from scratch. Because Miami is unable to build a new airport because it would have to happen in the Everglades, and environmental rules would not permit that. So when that decision was made, we had to design something that could be that could deal with the existing conditions. And this is the complexity of the project. In fact, there's 2 sets of drawings: the temporary and the final construction. You can, because it has to have continuing operations. You can see here the access to the train station, the arrival of the train, the shopping mall that connects the 3 the concourses, the new ticketing, the ATO offices, the airline ticket offices, and everything you see in green, the retail. You can see the huge arrival hall for immigration, since this is the International Arrivals building, feeding 120 gates. It is, and you can see here the final form of the building and how the shape of the roof, the series of arches, are connected by other smaller curves to create almost this rippling effect of the roofs of the building. So that in fact they're not exactly vaults, even though they're built like vaults, because they actually warp to create the form that you see here. They're all suspended over green glass, but more importantly, the terracing is what allows natural light into the immigration hall, and into the shopping complex, and into the various public spaces of the building. And here you can see some of the other images of this airport and how it will feel. The roofs are intended to feel as if they were suspended and totally floating on the glass and of the building. And here are some of the sketches. These are some of the views of the inside. The actual supports of this roof are gigantic stainless steel sort of coral trees, and very abstract and geometric, all in steel, that are the elements that appear sort of as if they were almost crossing through the underside surface of in corrugated metal that makes that almost as if you were underwater. The other project I'm going to show you is our most recently completed project. I actually have images of the completed building. This is in France. This is in Dijon, France. The convention center and the opera house, a symphony hall, and 11 office buildings that comprise a business complex for the city, what they call Cité des Affaires. There's an interior street, a glassed-in street that leads to the convention center, the old and expanded convention center, conference center, and bridging across this avenue is this building that is both building and bridge that links this whole new complex of office buildings and shops and hotel and convention center to the main body of the public building that is the Symphony Hall and Opera House. We had a maximum height. This is a historic city where nothing can exceed the height of the steeples of the churches, and all this building had to be built within those parameters. You can see from the master plan how we created this whole new boulevard. These were railroad yards, by the way, and how out of this mega block we carved this citadel of walkways and plazas and streets and courtyards that are simply subtractive of the solid mass. In fact, the facade of the exterior is one, and the facade of the interior streets is another, and the plazas a third one. So you keep discovering these different skins, and almost as if you had cut through this sort of edge, this skin of a fruit, almost, that you come into that inner sanctum of the citadel. And you can see here our initial sketches, and you can see the different streets and the court of light, the court of greenery, the court of water, and the different paths of circulation that take you across into the rise to get to the other side. This is semi-public private land, and this is all public land, and we were required to build the entire opera house on this side and then link it over to the other side, and that's how the shape evolved. And that's when we cleaned up the whole form and created this gigantic curving boulevard. You can see here the intent of the idea of driving under and some of our sketches that formed these huge murals of wood as it was built, and you'll see how that scheme evolved. And this is quite similar to the completed building. Now you can see here the building as it was being completed, and how it bridges from one side to the other, and as you cross from behind and from the end as the avenues arrive to it, and then and I'll take you here closer. Of course, the landscaping is still not mature. And at nighttime, and I'll take you into the building. Here you can see where the boulevard actually slides under the building, and how the grand foyer, the arrival foyer, connects to the other side. This is the actual space underneath where you can look up to the sky, and this is the centerpiece inside the grand foyer, the arrival foyer to the building, and how it is perceived at nighttime and from within. As you look out. Once you're on top of that floor, you have a view of the city in front of you. It is the beginning of the procession leading to the actual performance space. And as you arrive from the rise of the escalator through these doors into the space, or as you walk through the edges of the room, and I apologize. And you can see here the big wood murals that I made reference to that traverse the various levels of circulation all the way down to the lowest level where the orchestra floor seating is located. Here you can see the different vistas that are framed. This is looking across through the underside of the bridge and foyer, looking across to the other side and looking up into that elliptical form. The base of the building where the bar and sort of pre-function space occurs. The bar, of course, is very important in France. You know, that's part of the idea of going to the theater. Very large bar, you know, and the vertical windows that move up and down like music off to one side and looking out to the street, which become at nighttime, in fact, the actual light fixtures, as you can see in this view. And these are the series of one of the many stairs that lead up to the second floor and to the various levels of the balconies. And these are some of the views. This is as you're driving through underneath next to the street, how you can look into the interior of the spaces of the building. This is the main reception room with its private terrace looking out to the city. The private terrace with this screen design looking out to the view at the distance. I take you now into the hall, because the hall is, for us, became a real experiment in how to deal with the functional requirements of visibility of the stage, and at the same time how to bring together a modern design and yet also the tradition of arts and crafts that these kind of buildings have. And in fact, these are wood panels in different colors of wood that fold in 3 dimensions as well, although the wood helps assist and give further depth to that composition. In fact, we dealt again with the whole interior of the building as some kind of a painting. And you can see here just the piece that supports what are the so-called Weinberg plateaus, these plateaus that occur on either side in lieu of boxes. And this is part of what a multi-purpose hall serves, that it's not only for opera, it's for symphonies, for lectures and other kinds of performances. And how to somehow create sort of an inner room that in a smaller event this gets darkened and disappears, and this becomes the actual hall inside, with this becoming the perimeter wall, as you see here. And I'll show you some additional details of that design. And it is difficult to tell this the geometry, but you can see it here, how some of the folds are vertical and some of them are horizontal, and start forming this sort of sculpting of the space, which at the same time has very valuable acoustical qualities. And here you can see the sense of the scale of the graphic elements that are very much part of the experience of being in the space. And lastly, I'm going to show you a couple of our sports projects, this being the arena in Atlanta. The newer part of our job being the renovation of CNN Center next door, and the creation of a whole new retail street leading to the convention center, and the construction of this new arena. Now, Atlanta is a very peculiar city because everything is elevated on viaducts, because it's the city, this is the railroad city. The city was built on top of the railroad tracks. And you can see here how, in fact, the arena is sunken in relation to the viaduct, and therefore is a very low-slung arena by comparison to other ones. It's not as vertical. What you enter, in fact, in the middle of the arena, and you descend down or up. But this allowed the opportunity to create a whole internal street here at the mid-level that I will show you in a second. It was part of our job to sort of urbanize Atlanta. We opened up a whole new street here where there used to be a parking lot. There's a new plaza that has been built by the city here, and we were trying to create almost like a city block, that you can see this perfect square that became a street edge along the entrance to the convention center. And finally, on the fourth side, we expressed the roofs of the building with these 3 curving, sort of sweeping shapes, until finally the last one becomes this grand porch that attaches to the edge of the one street that is not on the orthogonal grid. And this porch, supported by huge I-beams that, in the very abstract manner, hopefully read slightly the name of the city, and will become the identity as the building is introduced on television. It is, here you can see the section of the bowl which is also quite unusual because, as you can see, there are no suites on 3 sides of the bowl. They are very much in the tradition. This is in the mode of a theater, as if there was a curtain, but in fact it gets completed. As you see here, on 3 sides is the bowls when there were no suites, intimate, coming all the way to the ground. And on the 4th side, sort of like in Camden Yards, where there's a building on the side, the lower bowl continues, but the upper bowl becomes a whole building of 4 stories where all the 200 suites are located. And I'll take you through, this is the inner street that I was referring to that serves the 3 sides of the main bowl, and the main street that crosses through and underneath. And this is the lighting, the red lighting that will transform those letters at nighttime, and the actual arrival, the monumental arrival through this big porch into the building that is glass and transparent and very evident as to what happens inside. And lastly, I'm going to show you the arena we're doing in Miami for the Miami Heat. It is part of a master plan of downtown and its waterfront for a new port. And within it is the arena itself. As you come down from the highways into downtown, the arena is a simple elliptical shape, just like the Colosseum, made out of a simple grid of concrete. But attached to this grid are these series of prows or sails that are sort of curving and enveloping and wrapping the building around. Off to one side, this wedge that you see here is the practice court. That is, instead of being in a basement, it's taken out of the basement and expressed into a building, as you see here, with a big window looking out to the waterfront. And here you can see the arena itself with its series of forms that wrap asymmetrically around it, and with its big windows opening out on one side to the city, as I showed you before, and on the other side to the waterfront. These are the actual architectural drawings. These are the computer drawings that are how the building is really being built. The more hardline drawings where you can see these forms that wrap around the building and sort of are opening up to reveal a piece of the interior with the escalators and stairs leading up to the different levels. On this side, opening to the city. On the sides, you can see these openings into the concourse and the suites that I'm going to show you in some other images. And towards the ocean side, you can see the forms coming around as well. And here you can see one of the other sides. The building transforms itself. During the Miami Heat games, the lighting inside is what gives the lighting instead of the outside. It begins in red towards the yellow, almost like the building was on fire inside. Sort of the color, like the name of the team. But when hockey comes, the building becomes blue and cool and icy. And this is the design of the seating inside. This is the actual seating bowl. And these colors that you see here are the color of the fabric of the seating. So that, in fact, the building begins in that sort of orangey yellow color at the court. And as it goes up, it fades away into the darkness of the maroon color, almost as if it was fading into darkness, focusing the whole brightness and action where the game is. And this is a transformation of an arena that you may be interested as architects to hockey for a big 17,000 seats. Basketball is, of course, larger, is 21,500 seats. This is for a large concert configuration with 15,000 seats. Small concert configuration with 5,000 seats. IMAX theater configuration with 3,000 seats. It is a very flexible arena. One of the nice features of this arena is that the private suites have private balconies and actually go through from the inside to the outside, as you see here. In fact, VIP seating has its own arrival to a private suite where you can have your 4 seats right here, for a simple $12,500 a game. And they're sold out, believe it or not. And they have that person has a private living room and dining room underneath the bleachers right next to him and access to his car below. There's a club that is underneath the stands. And these are the private suites that begin here. These are the little sort of opera boxes, the loges, what we call. And the suites begin here and go all the way through, and they have their private balconies, their humidor for a cigar, looking out to the harbor of Miami. I mean, this is a tropical arena. You wouldn't do this in a place like Chicago, you get blown away by a cold wind. But in Miami, this is sort of the nice atmosphere, steep floor, rails as if you were in a ship. Some of the fun things about this arena is, this is Frank Stella, the famous artist, has designed this incredible band shell that would be facing towards the back. You can see it right here. This is the arena windows looking out, and there's sort of a whole entertainment terrace that gets closed off during events where they have barbecues looking out to the harbor and to Biscayne Bay. And this is the view of the arena inside. These are some of the lighting schemes that are part of the arena. These little lines that you see here that you saw in the other renderings are, instead of a big marquee, these are like LEDs that are racing down the facade of the building that announce the upcoming events. And when there's no announcement, they're just simply colored lights that sort of streak through the facade and give it speed and movement. And here you can see some of the rest of the images as the building is being built. And I think that's all I'm going to show you today. Thank you very much.